Hello guys, welcome to a new class of American and European relations in this week of Feria. Today we're going to be talking about Russia once again, and remember that tomorrow we have the pop quiz about this class and the one we had on Monday. Today we're going to talk about a slightly different issue. We're going to talk first in the first half of the class about Chechnya and the wars in Chechnya and also how that affected Vladimir Putin leadership. And in the second half of the class, we're going to talk about the aftermath of the war, Chechnya, and terrorism, which is quite an interesting relation. And last but not least, we're going to make a few remarks on the war on terror. But let's get started and let's talk about Chechnya. You might wonder what Chechnya is. Chechnya is this republic within the Russian Federation. Before it was a republic within the Soviet Union, but in the Caucasus, there to the south of Russia, next to Georgia. And actually, Georgia is quite an interesting territory. Why? Because of the demographics. 95% are Chechen ethnicity, obviously a majority of its own ethnicity, and over 95% of the population of Chechnya follows Sunni Islam, actually. And this will play a very interesting role later when we talk about the relation between Chechnya and terrorism, and particularly, obviously, Islamic terrorism. And you can already create a connection there. But let's talk a little bit about the history of Chechnya. And we are going to talk about the first Chechnyan war that took place between 1994 and 1996. Actually, the causes for the origins of this war have to do with the process of discomposition of separation of the Soviet Union and how all these territories, how all these nationalities within the Soviet Union claim independence. Most of them actually, eventually, they reach agreements with Russia that they will gain autonomy and fiscal autonomy within the federation, within the Russian Federation, but they will not be an independent country. This was not the case with Chechnya. Chechnya also has to do with its demographics and the cultural differences between the Russian and Chechens, and that resulted that they were unable to reach any agreement on the status of Chechnya. And during these 2 years, actually, it was more of a de facto independence. However, Moscow was not happy with this situation. So consequently, by the end of 1994, Boris Yeltsin, decided to send troops to Chechnya to regain control of the region and annex it to the Russian Federation. However, the military superiority of Russia was enormous. Just think about the population disparity there. However, Chechens had something benefiting them, and actually was the strategy they used during this first Chechnya war, and actually was the guerrilla war. Obviously, Russian troops took capital city Grozny relatively easy. However, they never had real control of the region, nor of the cities because of these constant attacks, nor of other areas of the country. If you look at the map before, if you look at pictures of Chechnya, you will see that it's a very mountainy country. So it made it very difficult for Russians to hold control of it. It's something very similar to Afghanistan. If you think of Afghanistan, Russia left Afghanistan, the US left Afghanistan as well. Kind of left Afghanistan, but it was very hard to grasp control of Afghanistan because of its landscape. Same thing happened in Chechnya. And actually in 1996, something very important was taking place, and those were elections. And Boris Yeltsin was at that time very unpopular because of the war in Chechnya. So he decided to halt it and to sign a ceasefire with the authorities in Grozny. However, this was an unsolved business, so still the factor Chechnya was still independent, kind of. It had autonomy. Moscow would not interfere on Chechnyan issues. And the agreements were signed between both parties to prevent the electoral damage that this could cause Boris Yeltsin. The second Chechen war, we already kind of talked about it. It started, it was a very rather short campaign between 1999 and 2000. And actually it started, one of the reasons why the war was triggered had to do with terrorist attacks in Moscow. This is one of the terrorist attacks actually to flats in Moscow. This is Islamic terrorist attack. And as a retaliation, Boris Yeltsin, who was still president of the Russian Federation, decided to put in charge of their campaign in Chechnya this man that you see in the picture, that is Vladimir Putin. And obviously, we already mentioned how Vladimir Putin got popularity throughout this conflict, and how allowed him to be design as the successor of Boris Yeltsin for the 2000 election. This war in Chechnya was slightly different. Also, during the first war in Chechnya, you have to think that still, I mean, even though it might seem already a long time, but between 1994 and 1996, I mean, at that time, the Russian military was still reorganizing after the collapse of the Soviet Union. At this time, Russia did have a more organized military, and also the strategies they followed was slightly different. It was not that much, oh, well, you also put foot on the ground, but also had to massive bombings of cities in Chechnya was a strategy. So it was not that much about gaining total control. It was more, I mean, it was kind of a burnt soil. I mean, by the end of the day, deciding that they will take control one way or the other didn't really matter. The civil casualties that might be caused during that conflict. Quite interesting. I mean, we're going to go to the aftermath of the war after the break. But before we finish, I want to make sure that we understand that actually this war in Chechnya, the second war in Chechnya, and the role Vladimir Putin played in this second war in Chechnya, also built up to Vladimir Putin's approach to international society. We said on Monday actually that Boris Yeltsin government very first approach was actually that the West were to be allies. But actually, and from that they turned to a balance. But Vladimir Putin saw it differently. Actually, he saw how being an hegemon and how kind of going back to that nostalgic power of the Soviet Union played well for the elections, and actually that reinforced that identity of Russia being an hegemon, trying to be an hegemon once again, and made Vladimir Putin's approach to the West completely different from the approach of Boris Yeltsin. So, I mean, bear that in mind. That was a very big change into foreign policy for Russia, and actually I mean, all what we talked about on Monday in terms of interfering in elections, or the role of Russia in Ukraine and getting involved in that has to do also with the leadership of Vladimir Putin and realizing how that will pay off electorally. So we're going to have a small break here, and after that I'm going to continue talking about this conflict and how that what that has to do with terrorism. So see you in a minute.